Hi, this is Hanno the Honda Machina, and welcome to the 10th and final episode of the History of Video Games, Part 10. And today we'll, of course, be looking at the history of computer gaming from the late 70s to the modern day. And I'm going to point out some of the most important technological innovations that I think have come along, and also some of the most important computers that have come along. The history of computer games is extremely long and complicated, and not really as much fun as the history of console games, to be honest, but I will try to make this as interesting as possible for you guys. We're not gonna go back to the Stone Age of the computers, which is really like the 1940s and 50s, where computers were massive, about the size of a room on average. In fact, the reason we have home computers in the first place is because of the invention of the microchip in the 1970s, which made it possible for computer components to become really tiny, and as a result it was finally physically possible to have a computer which, instead of being the size of a refrigerator, could actually comfortably sit on your desk. In the late 70s is when the first commercial home computers came out, although at the very beginning there was this very strong ideological debate going on about what exactly were people going to be using home computers for. Interestingly, two companies that kind of ended up on the complete opposite sides of this debate were Microsoft and IBM. Microsoft was actually one of the first companies to think that people would actually want to not just do like boring business stuff on their home computers, but actually play games. IBM, of course, thought, yeah, right. Probably is not as a surprise why it took IBM PCs a long time to establish themselves as a really popular computer game platform. And the computer games that came out in the late 70s don't really bear much discussing. Of course, we do have, interestingly, sort of the beginnings of one of my favorite video game genres, the adventure game genre, in the form of interactive fiction. Eek. Ugh. Just call it text adventure, I hate that word. And also the very first computer RPGs. You might be surprised to find out the very first Ultima was released back in 1980. But of course it was the early 80s when the computer gaming scene finally started to flourish, and this was largely because very affordable and surprisingly efficient home computers were starting to come out at this time. Some of the most popular models were the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and in the North American market, the Mac II, of course. However, the superstar of home computers in the early 80s was, of course, the Commodore 64. And what made the Commodore 64 so awesome? The fact that it had 64 kilobytes of memory. The Commodore 64's popularity was, of course, because it was a very impressive piece of machinery at a time when home computers were kind of difficult to use. And a lot of the Commodore 64's success is actually attributed to Jack Tramiel, who, depending on who you stand with, was either a business genius or an evil bastard. Because basically the Commodore 64's marketing edge was based on the fact that Tramiel basically just looked at all the competing models of computers that were out at the time and always lowered the Commodore 64's price accordingly. And I've mentioned before, because during the early 1980s we had that horrific event known as the video game crash of 1984, it was actually important that the computer gaming scene established itself at a very early phase, because whereas in America game companies started to go down left and right as a result of Atari's bankruptcy, in Europe many developers kept on making games, especially for the Commodore 64. These were of course the days when games came on C cassettes, which always blows my mind, honestly. Now, one thing I do have to mention though, even though Sony didn't really enter the video game industry in a serious way until the Sony PlayStation, Sony was in fact a sort of important player in the computer gaming scene during the 1980s, because that's when they came out with their own line of home computers, the MSX. A lot of you may have not heard of the MSX, mainly because it was never released in North America, but it was released in Japan, and it was also very widely available in Europe, and certain Japanese game companies like Konami really took off with the MSX, releasing some of their best-known titles on it, like Vampire Killer, the same year as the first Castlevania, and the original Metal Gear. However, if you ask me, computer games didn't really start to get good until the late 80s. I mean, seriously, you guys have seen me play Commodore 64 games, you know what I'm talking about. If Commodore 64 had been the rock star of home computers in the early 80s, in the mid-80s, Commodore completely outdid themselves when they came out with the Amiga 500. It was one of the first 16-bit home computers to come out. Its performance powers compared to compared to the Commodore 64 was quite astounding. And although the Commodore 64, of course, had a lot of ports of popular console titles of the day, Amiga was really the gamer's computer during the late 80s. And during the late 80s, of course, floppy disks started to become very much the standard format for releasing games and programs, probably because you didn't have to rewind them or anything like that. We also had the emergence of optical media, although mostly in the arcades. In the mid-1980s, of course, the first two Laserdisc games were ever released, which were Dragon Slayer and Space Ace. But a smaller version of this optical media, the CD-ROM, was slowly beginning to creep into public consciousness. And of course, the late 80s is when LucasArts started to make their awesome adventure games. But let's jump to the 1990s now, because there's a lot more interesting stuff to talk about in the 1990s. Okay, in the early 1990s, something we started to notice was a lot of these different computer companies going bankrupt. At the start of the 90s, the only serious computer companies left around were Mac, IMB, and Amiga, or the Commodore Amiga, whichever you prefer. By the mid-90s, really there was only one person standing. But before we get to the home computer boom of the mid-1990s, first of all, we talked about the whole craziness with the CD-ROM and FMVs and all this stuff. And if the console industry went through a rather embarrassing flirt with FMV and CD-ROMs in the early 90s, as you may remember from the History of Video Games Part 6. The home computer industry's embarrassing flirt with the CD-ROM format was much longer and far, far more embarrassing. I mean, there were just a lot more games that were made during this time with that horrible FMV look. In the mid-90s, of course, the emergence of one of the most horrible word combinations that has ever been invented: interactive multimedia CD-ROM. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the Lion King interactive storybook as much as any 7-year-old would, but there was just a lot of shitty software being released on home computers just for the sake of promoting the CD-ROM. Although it wasn't really necessary, because the home computer industry found more elaborate and useful ways to utilize the CD-ROM. I mean, everybody saw that this was going to be the wave of the future. The only thing that the CD-ROM wasn't very good for originally was the fact that you couldn't write data on it, you could only read it. But by the late 90s, we already had writable and rewritable CD-ROM units anyway, so... And of course, the mid-90s was the big home computer boom, and really it can be attributed to a number of factors. The biggest one, of course, being Windows 95. Ever since the 3-dot series of Windows operating systems, they had sort of started to establish themselves in the public consciousness as very simple, user-friendly operating systems. Also, the internet finally exploded into public consciousness. It had been around for quite a long while. In fact, internet connection has been publicly available since really the 1980s. But the World Wide Web was important because previously the internet was just a bunch of text that you would get from your modem. You would have to kind of know what the hell you were doing with it, whereas www allowed you to make these colorful websites with pictures and stuff, and you only needed to write a little address to take you where you wanted to be. And with the popularity of the internet, online gaming started to emerge, and really with Windows 95 being such an awesome operating system that everybody liked using, we can kind of see what happened to the Macs and the Amiga. Oh yeah, and of course in the early 90s, the FPS genre was born full force with Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and my personal favorite, Duke Nukem 3D, and with the appearance of Quake, of course. True 3D graphics and 3D acceleration sort of became the norm, which meant that you had to buy these ridiculously pricey pieces to add into the inside of your computer to make your 3D games actually run kind of smooth. And although the Macs kind of took it in the ass in the late 90s, of course in the early 2000s the Mac computers finally came back in full force, first in the form of the iMac and whatever iProducts really have come out ever since. And online gaming, thanks to broadband and things like that, has exploded. I mean, seriously, before this, online gaming was kind of something that small groups and collections of nerds would do. Now it seems like everybody does it. And just like everywhere else, DVD became the dominant format for games. There you go. As I said, I'm not very knowledgeable about computer stuff anyway, and what I've just pointed out are really the things that I find personally interesting, and perhaps this installment just didn't have the same information value as the previous chapters before. As I promised, I will now list what I think are the 10 most important computer games in history. These are not in any particular order. First of all, there's Ultima, really was responsible for popularizing the RPGs on home computers. Then there's Elite, one of the really first full-fledged 3D games, not to mention promoting the concepts of free spaceflight and exploration in games. The King's Quest series, of course, for creating the graphic adventure game genre, my favorite. Tetris, because of their importance to the puzzle gaming genre. And yes, although Nintendo probably has the biggest stake on Tetris, it was a computer game to begin with. Doom really exploded FPS games into popularity, and it was also one of the first games to utilize online multiplayer. Number 6, this is actually 2 games, but I have to mention them sort of in the same sentence because they are very important in this regard. Quake and Unreal, which started this never-ending battle of the game engines. Command & Conquer, of course, created the real-time strategy genre. Alone in the Dark was one of the first real survival horror games. Half-Life proved that you could actually do something interesting with FPS games, and of course the people that then came up with Team Fortress totally took a dump on that. And World of Warcraft, of course, for giving birth to that wonderful acronym, MMORPG. But that has been me. I hope you enjoyed this series. My apologies if this last episode wasn't quite up to the same scratch as the previous ones, but I've explained before why that is. But I really did enjoy making this series. I hope everyone found this both entertaining and even a little educational. And I hope to make more awesome game-related videos in the future. Maybe ones where I'm finally actually getting to play some games instead of just talking about them. So that's that. See you on the next one. Final episode. Gotta get my shit together. Fixing my hair in front of the camera. Across the 110th Street, pimps try to catch a woman that's weak. Really hope this thing works out pretty well. Okay, gotta say hi to the camera. Hi, this is Hannu the Honda Mäkinen, and welcome up kind of on the opposite sides of this. I hate this. I hate this when I have the sentence right in my head, and I just can't get through it. Come on, come on, come on. Interestingly, this is the point where I'm supposed to continue the argument, but I lose the track of thought. I hate this. I hate this. This is why editing was invented. Some of the most popular models, of course, were the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. I hate that name. Sinclair ZX Spectrum.